inviting me to speak. And good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's nice to be sharing some space with you all, even if virtually, from my home here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And what I want to do in my talk this evening is introduce you to my research on the history of schooling and settler colonialism, focusing mostly on the new book I've just published called Lessons in Legitimacy. And while British Columbia might seem far removed from Ottawa, there are a number of direct connections that I'll draw out and highlight and speak to, specifically regarding jurisdiction over what was known as Indian education. So here's an outline of what I'll be speaking about. And overall, what I'm going to do is show how the book and my research generally helps put truth before reconciliation, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and many Indigenous peoples, including Murray Sinclair, the TRC's chair, have called for. The need to acknowledge and confront the difficult truth about residential schooling to support the work of survivors is what Coast Salish artist Luke Marston represents on the TRC Bentwood box here on the slide. And that is actually housed in the gathering space of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, located here on the University of Manitoba campus, where I'm a research partner, and you can kind of see in my background filter, so you don't see all my cat trees in the background. We are still learning the full truth about residential schooling and things like Indian day schools and their ongoing legacies. The TRC's final report and its calls to action are only the beginning of the truth-telling process, not its end, as has been made apparent by the recent announcements concerning the location of potential unmarked graves at various former residential school sites across Canada in the past year and a half, including at Kamloops, at Kootenay, and Williams Lake in British Columbia. And in addition to my scholarly research, I'm currently serving as the historical consultant for the Squamish Nation on their project looking at the St. Paul's Residential School in North Vancouver, where I'm from, and I'll talk about that more in a second. So before Canada rushes reconciliation and leaves the truth behind, we need to first press pause to really understand the truth, to sit with it, embrace it, and evaluate it, and use it to challenge our attitudes and change our actions, all in the effort to create a strong foundation of truth, trust, and justice in these lands as the very precondition for reconciliation. In my talk this evening, I'm going to provide an overview of my research and explains how it contributes to this process by better understanding the history of how various kinds of schooling supported settler colonialism in British Columbia. I'm going to begin, though, with a standpoint reflection, that is by positioning myself as a white settler scholar, as a non-Indigenous person in this work, and showing how my personal relationship to truth and reconciliation and my efforts to live in a good way are deeply intertwined and form the foundation of my work. Then I will outline how, from that foundation, my research on the history of schooling and settler colonialism helps put truth before reconciliation. And while I'm not going to be focusing on abuse or centering Indigenous trauma, that's not my work to do as a non-Indigenous historian. The presentation contains details that may be upsetting, and so I've included the information for the Indian Residential School Survivor and Family Crisis Line on the slide here, and I'll stick around and help folks process afterwards, and you can always send me an email to connect and talk more if that would be helpful. Okay. To begin, I'm particularly interested in the role of schooling in the making of British Columbia as a colonial society, because this is where I'm from, where I first learned to understand myself and my place in the world. This is Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish nations. I'm originally from North Vancouver on the north shore of Burrard Inlet, across from downtown Vancouver. And I grew up in what is known as Lynn Valley. And just down the hill are three reserves along the North Shore there. And the Kitsilano and Musqueam reserves are out towards UBC's campus, which is just sort of at the bottom left and over from your screen, for those of you familiar with the city. And this kind of settler capitalist spatial organization has shaped much of my life and research interests. My family lived near where the former Squamish or St. Paul's Indian Residential School and Day School operated for almost 100 years, between the 1890s and 1970s. And I passed by those sites many times without knowing about the history and ongoing legacies of those schools. And for those of you familiar with the city, I can't point to it on the screen here, but it's on the North Shore by the Lonsdale area, which is the kind of cluster of development you see there. So just to the left is where the Mission Indian Reserve was, and just to the right of it was where the St. Paul's Indian Residential School and Day School were located. I understood nothing about how settler colonialism more broadly created my home very recently and provided me with a number of privileges that profoundly shaped my life and that I mostly took for granted. I did not think critically about my experience growing up as a settler until I attended university, where I took courses on the history of Indigenous peoples and British Columbia. These courses and conversations with Indigenous students and professors helped me realize how much of what I had learned, formally and informally, justified colonization and normalized the creation and ongoing maintenance of British Columbia's settler capitalist society as commonsensical. As I began to question these lessons in legitimacy, I committed myself to a practice of unlearning and relearning how to live in a better way. As well, at the same time, I started to learn more about the history and ongoing legacy of Canada's Indian residential school system from a new family member, Patrick, a Kwakwaka'wakw survivor of the St. Michael's Indian Residential School at Alert Bay, which is just off the northern part of Vancouver Island. And through our conversations, I understood more about the nature of schooling in colonial settings in British Columbia. I realized that it played a destructive and creative role, to borrow from anti-colonial writer Albert Memmi, in our respective lives, and prepared Patrick and I to take up very different positions in society. As a result, I wanted to learn more about the origins of state schooling for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and their role in supporting the making of British Columbia. And after many conversations about his experiences, Patrick gifted me a sacred bundle, including an eagle feather, which is a symbol of truth and leadership, and asked me to learn more about this history. But the gift was also a responsibility, and it came with the expectation of ongoing reciprocity. Patrick wanted me to share what I learned with others to help put truth before reconciliation and create pathways for healing and justice. And I agreed. And over the past 15 years, I've worked to honor that relationship and responsibility, and have devoted my scholarly research to better understand the ways in which different kinds of schooling for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people like Patrick and I played complementary roles in supporting settler colonialism and the making of British Columbia. And my goal has been to better understand the truth about the relationship between schooling and colonialism to create possibilities for reconciliation and decolonization. And my research contributes to this process in a number of ways that I'll now explain. Schooling's role in colonialism is portrayed here in John Gast's famous painting, American Progress, which uses settler mythology to romanticize colonialism on the so-called American frontier. In the middle here is an angelic white woman wearing the Star of Empire on her forehead, stringing power lines as settlers move west. You may have seen this image before. But if you look more closely, she's also holding a school book. One of my professors showed this image in one of the first history classes I took, and I remember being fascinated by the school book part. And I wanted to learn more about schooling's role in empire making and settler colonialism closer to home. So for my first research project, I turned my attention up to the cloudy and probably rainy Pacific Northwest in the top left-hand corner of your screen, which I think is the only thing that Gast's painting accurately depicts. And I wanted to look at how schooling and school books, or textbooks in particular, played a role in colonization. This project was a detailed examination of how Indigenous people were represented in high school history textbooks, authorized for use in British Columbia public schools between 1920 and 1970. Building on the work of theorists like Edward Said and Indigenous scholars like Sioux historian Philip J. Deloria, this study was my first attempt to really reckon with colonial knowledge and the logics of white possession. Knowledge that my grandparents and parents, and likely some of my own teachers, had access to in this period, and that shaped the way they understood and taught me about colonization and Indigenous peoples. In fact, the project all started when my grandma was clearing out her basement and gave me an old history textbook of my mom's. And when I opened this textbook, which is Arthur Dorland's Our Canada Here on the right, I was pretty shocked. This book, which was published in 1949, but was still being used in some classrooms in British Columbia until the 1970s, had images like this at the bottom and referred to Indigenous peoples, and these are extracted quotes, as bloodthirsty savage cannibals from China that needed to either assimilate or face extinction. And when I started to look at other textbooks, I noticed that while some were better than others, the ways in which Indigenous people were represented followed a pretty stereotypical pattern that was not only racist, but also that justified colonization and the creation of Canada as commonsensical, as something natural and inevitable, not to be questioned. At the end of this project, I discovered that all of the textbooks that I had understood as being targeted only to settler children in public schools were also officially authorized by the Department of Indian Affairs, based out of Ottawa, for use in day and residential schools across the province at the same time. This finding really challenged me to think about how schooling for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children, well, of course, very different, overlapped in significant ways, and at core, shared a common goal of transforming Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples through schooling into what Memi calls the colonized and the colonizer, to support the overall creation and maintenance of a colonial society. Much of this is learned in school, and my work since has been trying to better understand this process more broadly, and this has been the focus of my major research project to date. So this project, which is now a book published in September with UBC Press, goes back to the beginning of settler colonialism on the West Coast and traces the role played by schooling in colonial social formation between 1849 and 1930. The book royalties are being donated to the Indian Residential School Survivor Society, and UBC Press has a special discount for this event that gets you 50% off and free shipping if you'd like to pick up a copy, and that information is at the bottom there for you. So the book uses archival research and insights from Indigenous studies to unsettle conventional views of schooling history in Canada by bringing accounts of Indigenous and non-Indigenous education, often studied in isolation as separate subjects, into one analytical frame to show how they overlapped and contributed to colonialism. And overall, the project shows how different levels of government, imperial, federal, and provincial, use different forms of schooling to aid social formation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including mission, day, and residential schools for Indigenous children, and common and public schools for settler children. And I'll talk more about complicating that binary in a moment when I talk about the cover image. But first, I'm going to talk about my methodology and sources, and then I will explain my main research findings. Interpreting causality and tracing the contours of change over time are central to my research as a historian. But I'm also an Indigenous studies scholar, and so decolonizing methodology is equally important. Métis political scientist Adam Gowdry argues that research on Indigenous peoples is often an extractive process that tends to reproduce tired colonial narratives that justify occupation, oppression, and nation building. Maori scholar Linda Tuai-Smith argues much the same, and as a countermeasure, outlines a number of projects for researchers, including historians, that emphasize relationships, responsibility, respect, and reciprocity in our work. Though sometimes this is challenging to do in historical work in the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, I still engage many of these projects. And I want to pause on just one, reading, and reflect on how it relates to my historical practice. I take seriously the project of reading against the colonial grain to critically interrogate the archival records I use as evidence throughout the project. In the British Columbia context, historians such as Adele Perry and Secwepemc scholar Sarah Nichol argue that the archival record is suspect and largely privileges settler conceptualizations of history. As such, Indigenous people, if they appear in the archives at all, are often depicted in ways that rationalize colonial power. I thus aim to consult archival sources that I collected in the National Archives in the UK, Library and Archives Canada at Ottawa, and the BC Archives in British Columbia, to name the big archives, in ways that, while certainly not free from the confines of colonial power, at least challenge colonial common sense and the erasure of Indigenous peoples and perspectives on the past to create space for new knowledge. Historians Mary Ellen Kelm and Keith Smith's recent collection, called Talking Back to the Indian Act, outlines a number of critical questions, which is their table is reproduced here on the slide. These kind of critical questions to ask when reading colonial archival sources against the grain that I use in my research. In this way, Lessons in Legitimacy draws on and reads a range of archival sources against the grain, including public school and Indian Affairs annual reports, previously neglected public school records and colonial office correspondence, education materials such as textbooks and curriculum documents, and thousands of newly digitized school files related to the creation and administration of mission, day, and residential schools in British Columbia. I also include Indigenous autobiographies and memoirs by Simon Baker and Bev Sellers, for example, that speak back to the sources of this period. But I mostly try to focus on what I felt was appropriate for me to tell in this story, which is really focusing on the church and state's role in devising, deploying, and defending colonial school systems over an 80-year time period to support the truth-telling process initiated by survivors. And there are a number of contributions or lessons to be learned from this project that I'll now explain. The first is that I position the history of public schooling as being a key part of settler colonialism and the building of British Columbia. While recent scholarly work and things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have shown the destructive effects of schooling for Indigenous children, which I outline and we'll talk about in a moment, many scholars studying the history of education conceive of public schooling as being progressive, unproblematic, or at least disconnected from the project of settler colonialism, which was happening elsewhere. My research challenges and complicates this view by showing how public schooling helped teach settler children in ways that encourage them to participate in and protect an emerging settler society. To do so, I draw on the work of British historian Catherine Hall to argue that settlers needed to learn how to become colonizers across the British Empire. And schools are particularly powerful sites for learning what I call the lessons in legitimacy, that is, the formal and informal teachings that normalize the colonial project as natural, inevitable, and most importantly, unchangeable. Starting in the 1840s and 1850s, I examine how the emerging colonial government of British Columbia supported common or grammar schools as a way of attracting settlers and their families to the region. And then in the 1870s, the new provincial government oversaw the implementation of a free but compulsory public school system to further teach children everything from history and civics to calisthenics and home economics in overt and covert ways that built their character and prepared them to take up their roles in society as colonizers, as subjects, and defenders of the British Empire. And on the screen here, you see children raising the flag and saluting at the Kingston Street School in Victoria in the early 1900s. In tracing this development over an 80-year period from 1849 to 1930, I show how the state gradually consolidated control over public schooling and used it, like other state infrastructure, to support colonial social and economic development in a number of significant ways. As well, I show how public schooling in British Columbia was largely paid for by dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their land. Here in the 1850s, Britain simply asserted sovereignty over what became the colony of British Columbia. And then the province of British Columbia refused to sign treaties with Indigenous nations, like those treaties that were signed across the prairies. And as a result, much of British Columbia's land base was and remains stolen, unceded land. And during the early period of colonial settlement, and in an effort to attract but also to retain colonists and their families, state officials often reserved free plots of land to be used for the construction of schools. And then property taxes were then introduced to help pay for increased schooling costs. The stolen Indigenous land underwrote the expansion and maintenance of the public school system in British Columbia as elsewhere. All right, alongside my analysis of the development and expansion of public schooling, I also examine the unique contours of state schooling for Indigenous children over the same 80-year period and show how they contributed to the same result while using very different methods. And this is where the Ottawa connection comes in, with many decisions about Indian education, as it was called at the time, being made by Department of Indian Affairs officials in the city, and then that have ripple effects throughout the country. So schooling for Indigenous people in British Columbia has that Ottawa connection. Now, one issue with the existing research on residential schools in particular is that much of it is national in scope and focus. The provincial perspective is mostly neglected or mentioned briefly. And this is a problem because, while the Department of Indian Affairs certainly operated on a national scale, and it was directed in a bureaucratic sense from Ottawa, it was organized and administered, especially at first, more locally. So much can be learned from looking at this history in a more local frame that, of course, does not ignore the national and transnational and transimperial connections. And I'm just going to focus on some of the more notable findings in this regard of thinking about state-supported Indigenous schooling. Many scholars study the connection between church, state, and education for Indigenous peoples as emerging in the 1880s and 1890s. But I show that from mid-century, the colonial government of British Columbia, as it was getting started, played an active role in inviting, directing, and even funding Christian missionaries to travel to the Pacific Northwest to open schools for Indigenous children in the 1850s and 1860s, before Canada's system of so-called Indian education was officially started. As part of my focus on early mission schools, I show how colonial officials, far from being motivated by benevolence or a commitment to a so-called civilizing or Christian project, were actually anxious about Indigenous resistance to colonization in areas like the Pacific Northwest coast near Metlakatla, which is shown here. And they hoped that supporting early mission schools could smooth over relations with different Indigenous communities before settlement occurred. In this case, the Tsimshian Nation, they wanted to smooth relations over to safeguard colonial security and to bolster British control in the region. I then extend this finding to the origins of the first residential schools in the province. In fact, Metlakatla becomes the first in 1888-89, after having been first established as a mission school in the 1860s. So I look at that continuity. And here the federal government officially partners with churches to establish a national system of Indian education. And William Duncan of Metlakatla even made his way out to Ottawa in the early 1870s to consult on things like the creation of the Indian Act and to advocate for government support, federal government support of boarding schools for Indigenous people. Again, this is before the official residential school system gets started, and most historians attribute to the influence of people like Egerton Ryerson and folks based in Ontario. But my research shows that people like William Duncan in British Columbia also had that lobbying influence on Indian policy, and particularly around education and schooling. And in examining the correspondence of state and church officials more closely on a local level, which is where I found the references to Duncan, I discovered this continuity between old and new schooling initiatives, and that the selection for the sites of British Columbia's first residential schools actually had more to do with trying to undercut local authority and undermine strongholds of Indigenous resistance to support colonization in the province and the development of a capitalist economy and Canadian nation building more generally. So Metlakatla here, Cooper Island off the east coast of Vancouver Island, and Cranbrook were chosen as the first sites for residential schools in the province. And these were known as sites of Indigenous resistance to colonial policy and to the lack of treaties and land rights in the province. And that's where the Department of Indian Affairs chose to open and fund the first schools in the Pacific province. In fact, the school at Cranbrook here, which is actually still standing today, first opened in an old Northwest Mounted Police barracks, established to contain a growing resistance movement in the Kootenay region in the 1880s. And when the police left, missionaries took it over and then eventually built a bigger school that, as I said, still stands today. In short, these first schools were created not just to educate or even assimilate Indigenous children, as was often talked about, but to school them as part of the process of trying to check Indigenous power to help facilitate the building of British Columbia and Canada as a settler society. I was also able to move beyond the usual Department of Indian Affairs records and reports and get into some of the correspondence from the period that allowed me to get a better glimpse at the conditions of the early residential schools in British Columbia, specifically as reported by or to Department of Indian Affairs officials. And this allowed me to see the very clear problems with the schools right from the start, which I'm actually not going to outline in great detail today. But the problems are remarked upon from the beginning, notably by Indigenous parents and students and some school staff even, which challenges the idea that no criticisms of the system existed at the time. And what is perhaps most fascinating about my findings in this regard are the various examples of resistance to these early schools that I uncovered by Indigenous students and parents, again, from the start, ranging from running away to student strikes and even parent boycotts, to many students organizing to burn down their schools. In fact, as I explain in one part of the book, on Vancouver Island in 1916-17, there was actually an arson outbreak where 3 different schools were burned down and 2 more were attempted. And so I'm able to, for the first time, sketch and map these local cultures of resistance over a long period of time and show how they can be understood as a form of what Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner calls survivance, or a mixture of resistance and creative survival tactics. I also offer the first sustained examination of the Indian day school system in British Columbia that emerges at the same time as the Indian residential school system and is really a continuation of the early mission day schools that were located closer to communities that I talked about earlier. It's just that now the funding came from the federal government for the most part. Despite the class action lawsuit about day schooling that concluded in July with a bit of an exemption period going until January 13th of this year, we still know very little about day school experiences. And my work outlines the development of these schools too, and their connections to other kinds of schooling and colonial policies at the time. And here is a map of all the Indian day schools in Canada from the 1860s to the year 2000 that I helped create with Jackson Hind at Trent University. In total, there were 699 schools across the country, with 112 operating in British Columbia, with the last closing only in 1994. The last residential school, St. Mary's in Mission, closed in 1984. So the Indian day school system in British Columbia lasts another 10 years after the last residential school is closed. This has gone through all the way from the 1860s to 2000. Yeah, okay. I'll go back. This is the Alert Bay Mission Day School, which was started in 1885. And again, this is my father-in-law's community of Alert Bay. Like residential schools, day schools were partially funded by the federal government and run by different Christian missionaries. The goal of undercutting and delegitimizing Indigenous lifeways to support colonization and nation building was the same as residential schooling. But the big difference was that day schools were usually located on reserve and children could return to their families or guardians after school. That proximity, however, was why the government and church officials really preferred the residential school system, because they could more effectively separate children from their communities. And while it is tempting for some, I think I hear this a lot, to think of day schools as a less severe kind of schooling for that reason, because they were closer to family and community. Some of my research shows that similar issues of abuse, sickness, and death pervaded this system as well. Okay, well, the bulk of my research focuses on examining different kinds of schooling for Indigenous and non-Indigenous children and understanding their separate jurisdictions, provincial and federal, respectively. I also ended up discovering that the lines separating or segregating schooling in British Columbia were often blurred, broken, and challenged in everyday educational life. Colonial binaries were reinforced, yes, but also continually challenged, which has not received as much scholarly attention. That is, throughout the 80-year period of study, I found consistent evidence supported by photographs such as this one of the Vancouver, of the Hastings Sawmill School in Vancouver in 1886, with the caption identifying whites and Indians outside the school, which is not too surprising because we know, thanks to the work of Andrew Parnaby and others, that many Squamish men worked on the docks and lumber mills around Burrard Inlet and likely wanted their children to attend these schools. Or this rare one from the inside of the Ashcroft Public School in the 1910s. And an interesting fact about this school is that if anyone's read Lee Maricle's Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, she talks about Ashcroft as this interesting example where Chinese migrant workers who came to build the railway end up settling in Ashcroft and intermarrying with Indigenous communities and then wanting to send their children to the public school system. So we don't have very many pictures of inside the schools at this time. Most photographs were taken outside. This is a rare one, again, showing the more complicated composition of the student body in places like Ashcroft. Okay, and then other images like this one of the South Fort George School, by Prince George, showing a number of Dakhla students, including Alex Bird on the far right here. And there is the image that was chosen for the cover. Again, in Prince George, it's fairly common knowledge. This school actually still exists and still stands in a park, marked, openly talking about Indigenous students, including the Bird family, attending this school. It's just that historians haven't picked up on that sort of local complexity as much. So photographs such as this, help us understand the more complicated nature of school attendance in this period. And though, of course, we need to be careful with colonial photographs as sources, Deloria suggests that they can also be read as windows of opportunity into what he calls Indians in unexpected places that can really challenge assumed narratives that contribute to Indigenous erasure. Again, assuming that Indigenous children all went to day or residential schools. In British Columbia, I found significant evidence that that is not the case, that Indigenous children not only attended public schools like this, but were often encouraged to attend by parents, teachers, and even state officials, including the Minister of Education of BC and the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa, approving and sometimes even paying for Indigenous children to go to public schools in the early 1900s, at a time when schooling is generally thought to be strictly segregated. In reality, the school attendance patterns were far more complicated on the ground. Indigenous children attended public schools in British Columbia for a whole host of reasons, including ensuring that the required number of children for funding from the provincial government was achieved so that local schools didn't close down, among other reasons. And I can talk more about this in the question period if folks are interested. So this finding, again, unsettles the way we think about Canada's history of settler colonialism and schooling as being strictly segregated until after the Second World War, which in British Columbia was just simply not the case. And this builds on some of the good work that Helen Raptis and Jean Barman have been doing in recent years, confirming and pushing it further. As well, many school officials in British Columbia moved between educational spheres, and we don't talk about this enough. So residential school principals sat on public school boards. Their students became teachers in day and residential schools, and public school graduates also taught in day and residential schools. As a kind of case in point, we can look at the career of Israel Wood Powell here, a doctor and early public school advocate and politician in 1860s Victoria, who then goes on to serve as BC's first superintendent of Indian Affairs in the 1870s, right? So he starts as a physician, as a politician, as a public school promoter, and then he transitions into a career as the superintendent of Indian Affairs, sort of working to implement DIA policy in British Columbia. And it's Powell who uses his position to lobby the Department of Indian Affairs to create new Indian day schools and Indian residential schools in the province, and where those locations would be best served, right? He would be arguing about Cooper Island, about Kootenay, about Kamloops. These are the locales of resistance. We need to establish the schools there, not at other places, right? And another kind of interesting fact about Powell, he was close friends with John A. Macdonald, who appoints him to this position. And of course, it bears mentioning that Macdonald was the elected representative of Victoria, British Columbia in the late 1870s and early 1880s, having been parachuted into the riding, right? And Macdonald puts also Powell in charge of the militia. So he's the superintendent of Indian Affairs for British Columbia, but he's also made symbolically the head of the militia to give him an air of military authority in his dealings with Indigenous people. And he took his post seriously, wearing his uniform to the office daily to mostly push paper. So Powell is sort of an interesting example of someone who is moving between these different spheres that we think operate separately, but we need to understand them as being more interconnected. Later in the early 1900s, another example is R.H. Carnes, who served as a public school teacher, a principal of the Kokalitsa Indian Residential School at Chilliwack, and then as the Department of Indian Affairs school inspector for the province of British Columbia. Again, showing those sort of overlapping connections. So these are some of the lessons outlined in the book about various kinds of state schooling and their overlapping roles in colonialism and the making of British Columbia's settler capitalist society. As just one node in the larger trans-imperial project, right? The sort of the building of Canada and the expansion of the British Empire. And I try and situate this history in that larger context. Okay, so to conclude, researching and writing this book taught me an important lesson. Colonial legitimacy is neither natural nor inevitable. It is learned, and it can therefore be unlearned to create the path for decolonization and meaningful reconciliation. In fact, Murray Sinclair, the chair of the TRC, always says that education is what got us into this mess, and education is what's needed to get us out. In heeding the calls of the TRC and leaders like Sinclair, I believe that we have much to learn from continuing to put truth before reconciliation. And I hope that this book and my work generally can play a small role in that important work. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Maybe we'll just